On the 28th of May 1940, on the outskirts of the little-known town of Wormhoudt in northern France, a procession of prisoners marched. Those soldiers, men of the British Expeditionary Force, exhausted, frightened, and many wounded, had just achieved a remarkable feat and held off the advancing German army for 8 hours, every minute of which meant their comrades 12 miles away at Dunkirk could live to fight another day. Though, by the time they reached this unassuming location, it was clear that their courage would come at an enormous cost. Over the next few minutes, most would lose their lives at the hands of the SS in an event that's gone down in infamy. In this video, we'll combine veteran testimony, historic imagery, and the latest technology to wind the clock back to those dark days of 1940 and reconstruct the events of what history remembers as the Wormhoudt Massacre. In order to tell that story, we need to go back in time a little to the 12th of May 1940. On that day, under a storm of artillery and the largest aerial bombardment in warfare to that point, German panzers of Army Group B emerged from the edges of the Ardennes forest, right here near the French town of Sedan. Within hours, they had scattered the outnumbered defenders and, despite valiant resistance, had punched through the French positions north of the Maginot Line and were racing for the sea. Within just 8 days, German armour had reached the coast here, splitting the BEF, Belgian and some French troops off from the rest of the Allied forces, which had swung southwards to defend Paris. The result was the creation of, at that time, the largest pocket of troops in military history, at the heart of which lay the port town of Dunkirk. Despite that massive breakthrough and the shockwaves that the speed of the German advance had sent through Allied High Command, the fight was not over. But it was clear it couldn't be sustained in the pocket. Something drastic was needed. That thing was Operation Dynamo, an enormous naval evacuation which would see more than 330,000 men ferry to Britain during a week of constant fighting. But in order for most men to go home, some had to stay. Enter the 2nd Warwicks. As a pre-war professional infantry battalion, part of the British 48th South Midlands Division, the Warwicks were capable soldiers, well-trained and confident in their abilities. The problem was, though, over the last fortnight of fighting withdrawals, the men had lacked in many of the essentials to sustain that fight. Ammunition, rations, anti-tank and artillery support were all in desperately short supply, meaning that when the German army appeared opposite these men in massive numbers around the 26th of May, they would need every ounce of courage and determination they possessed. Thankfully, there were plenty of men in the Warwicks who had both. Let's meet a few. 28-year-old Captain James Fraser Lynn Allen. Born to Scottish parents in Perthshire, he had been commissioned into the army in January 1932 and was by May 1940 commanding officer of D Company of the 2nd Battalion Warwickshire Regiment. Company Sergeant Major Augustus Jennings. Born to a working-class family in Rugby, Warwickshire in 1904, Augustus was a career soldier, having joined at just 17 and risen through the ranks over his 18 years in the army. Also in D Company was Private Bert Evans. A Davenport native, Bert was born in February 1921 and had enlisted in the army, joining the Gloucestershire Regiment in November 1938, before transferring to the Warwicks shortly after the outbreak of war. At just 19, he was one of the younger members of the battalion, but like so many of his comrades, was keen to do his bit. But it wasn't just men of the Warwicks who found themselves in this area before dawn on the 27th of May. There were also a scattering of troops from the 4th Cheshires, the Worcestershire Regiment and Yeomanry, several French soldiers, and gunners of the Royal Artillery. Amongst the latter was this man, Brian Fahey. Born in Kent, Brian was just 21 when war was declared, and like most young men of his age, was a keen sportsman with a love of cricket and football. He was also an accomplished musician, playing both the piano and the cello in his spare time. By 1914 though, spare time was a thing of the past, and he was fully engaged as a gunner in France with the 52nd Anti-Tank Regiment, Royal Artillery. Let's understand the relative positions on the eve of battle. By the morning of the 27th, the Dunkirk pocket looked something like this. In the north, the surrender of the Belgian army had meant the BEF now held a line running from the English Channel to Roubaix, across the old First World War battlefields. To their south, the French First Army were fighting hard around the city of Lille, but it was here to their west where the greatest danger lay. This area was covered by only ad hoc units, each given key towns and strong points to defend against the strongest forces in the German order of battle. Right in the heart of that sector, astride this key road which led directly to Dunkirk, was the town of Wormhoudt. Knowing that holding this position was absolutely vital to the success of the Dunkirk evacuation, 3 companies and various supporting units had been installed at key points, with A, B and D companies of the Royal Warwicks installed here in farms, houses, walled gardens and overlooking major crossroads. Their job was brutally simple: hold to the last man and the last round. On the other side of the wire that morning, though the Warwicks weren't to know it, were the men of a unit which had already gained a horrific reputation for brutality and will continue to do so throughout the Second World War, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Made up exclusively of die-hard Nazi Party members and volunteers from Hitler's personal bodyguard, it was the first in a line of units that would eventually expand to some 38 SS divisions. The SS Leibstandarte Regiment, as it was at the time, was under overall command of SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, but its 2nd Battalion, which would play the key part in the events to come, was commanded by the newly promoted SS Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Mohnke, 30-year-old from Lübeck, who would eventually go on to command the defence of central Berlin in 1945. It was they, along with panzers of the 19th Armoured Corps, who would lead the assault on Wormhoudt. The situation by dawn on the 28th of May was already dire. The previous day, the defenders of the hilltop town of Cassel had been surrounded. The besieged port of Calais had fallen, and all across the line in this area, the British were stretched perilously thin. The first signs of an impending attack in this sector, though, came around 6 AM when a German reconnaissance aircraft was seen overflying the Warwicks positions on the edges of the village of Eskilbeck. A short time later, that drone of aircraft multiplied as a flight of 15 Ju-87 Stukas descended on the area, bombing and strafing the defenders, with the howl of their sirens adding to the terror. There was no respite. A few minutes later, a heavy artillery bombardment slammed into the defenders' positions, destroying strong points, arresting movement and causing numerous casualties. With no artillery of their own, the Warwicks could do nothing but endure. Finally, at 7:45 AM, the advance began, with Mohnke's Old 5th and Hauptsturmführer Otto Baum's 7th Company of the 2nd Battalion Leibstandarte leading the assault from the west, aimed at the southern edge of Wormhoudt. Finally, the defenders could reply, and they did so by unleashing a hail of small arms fire on the oncoming SS, destroying at least 6 vehicles and causing heavy casualties which checked the advancing troops. Frustrated by the lack of progress, the Leibstandarte's commander Sepp Dietrich came forward himself and was ambushed at a British roadblock which left him pinned down in a ditch for several hours. Despite the heavy resistance all across the area, the enemy was simply too numerous, and with ammunition running low, the writing was on the wall. Launching further attacks to north and south, which cut communications with divisional headquarters, the defenders of Wormhoudt that could began to withdraw by about 1 PM. And when 45 minutes later a further heavy assault backed by tanks slammed into the thin Allied line, it was clear that the fight was lost. Knocking out the last remaining 2-pounder anti-tank gun in B Company's sector on the Eskilbeck Road, German armour now swept into the town and linked up with those troops advancing from south and southwest. By 4 PM, the last fire had died away and Wormhoudt had fallen. We might be forgiven for thinking that in this early part of the war in Western Europe, a courageous enemy would be treated as such by their captors. Not so here, as very quickly became evident. In fact, almost immediately upon entering the town, the horrific treatment of prisoners began. All over the area, awful scenes unfolded, with 5 men forced to dig a shallow grave here at Le Rierveld before being summarily executed by the SS, and Private Reginald Gould, who was shot whilst lying wounded and helpless on a bench near the Cassel Road. They were not the only cases. With men stumbling from shattered buildings, wounded being carried by lesser wounded, and exhausted men walking blindly through the streets, the SS quickly corralled them and marched them under a rain of rifle butts toward the town square. Once there, the brutal treatment continued, as Bert Evans remembered. First, they took all our personal effects. My photographs of my mum, dad and 2 sisters, even the photograph of Elizabeth, my wife. They were torn up and burnt. They didn't want any of us identified. By about 4:30 PM, perhaps as many as 100 men were gathered here in the town square, and under an SS guard were forced marched down this very street to this farmhouse, which earlier had been the scene of British defence. It was also here that things took a further sinister turn. Then occupied by Hauptsturmführer Mohnke, who had taken over command of the 2nd Battalion on that day, post-war sources state that Mohnke himself came out of his command post upon seeing the arrival of the POW column and demanded of the NCO commanding the escort, Why have you brought these prisoners here, contrary to orders? What exactly was meant by this statement is unclear, but the effect it had was not. Duly rebuked, the prisoner column was led through this gate and began a journey across this pasture towards a distant wooden structure located here. Today that journey is a peaceful 5-minute stroll, but in 1940 it was very different. As the group moved under escort of perhaps as few as 10 men, anyone seen to be straggling or unable to keep up found themselves on the receiving end of a rifle butt, bayonet, or burst of gunfire. Those that could, including a wounded gunner Fahey, moved on, eventually reaching what could now be seen as a semi-derelict old cowshed located here in the corner of a tree-lined pasture. Here's Fahey. I was so naive at this point that when I saw the barn I thought the Germans were taking us there for shelter. Over the next few minutes, around 100 men, many of them wounded, were forced into this barn at gunpoint, as the SS Guards, identified later as predominantly men from Hauptsturmführer Baum's 7th Company, began to form a semicircle around the building. Amongst the very last to enter was Bert Evans, who had a view of the following events. About the same time Evans was entering the barn, other men were in search of an exit. Royal Artillery driver John Borland and his friend Nobby Clark, who had been amongst the first to enter, found a rear exit, and after shifting some mud and straw managed to escape into this hedge-lined ditch and run some 100 yards unseen and eventually go to ground nearby. For many of those who stayed, their fate was all but sealed. The ranking officer amongst the remainder was Captain Lynn Allen, who, clearly concerned and perhaps fearing the worst, decided to protest. Stepping out of the entrance to approach an NCO, he highlighted that there were many wounded in the barn, none of whom were able to lie down. The NCO responded ominously that there will be plenty of room where you are going, to which Lynn Allen, who perhaps believed the reference was to a prison camp, said, "I am not satisfied with your reply." Any remaining doubt as to their fate dissolved in seconds when the same man reached down and pulled a stick grenade from his boot, pulled the ceramic ball attached to its fuse, and amidst the protests of Lynn Allen threw it directly into the crowded shed. The resulting explosion in the confined space wreaked havoc on the defenseless prisoners, killing several and wounding many others, including Bert Evans, whose right arm was almost severed by the blast. In the split second of that explosion, in which the SS outside had taken cover, Lynn Allen took the chance to grab Bert and haul him through the door and into this ditch running towards a small pond located here. Spotted as they fled, the SS opened fire as chaos erupted, but the only casualty in the melee was the accidental shooting of Rottenführer Ruger, allowing the two men to make their way right here, submerging into the pond for cover. Turning to see if they were clear of their captors, one man, believed to be Scharführer Dreschler, had followed and now fired 4 shots from his pistol. The first 2 struck Lynn Allen in the head, who sunk down, killed outright. One of the following 2 hit Evans in the neck, who too sunk into the pond. Believing his job complete, the SS man returned to the barn where the final act was about to unfold. With the cries of wounded men filling the air, now 2 more stick grenades were hurled into the barn. Both were stopped in an incredible act of courage as CSM Jennings and Sergeant Stanley Moore gave up their own lives using their bodies to smother the grenades, which exploded, killing both, but no one else. Tragically, there was still no reprieve. More grenades wounded more men in just a matter of seconds, continuing the carnage until, as Brian Fahey recalled, the SS, apparently feeling the method inefficient, changed tack. The next thing they did was call out, "Raus, 5 men, out 5 men. So 5 men went out. They lined up and had 5 Germans about 3 yards apart. It was sort of ceremonial really. It was a firing squad. Then there were 5 taken out and each one was shot. I was in such a state of despair that I thought, well, I'm not going to hang about for too long. I'm going to go out with the next 5, which I did. They called out the next 5, I went out, and because of the condition of my leg, I had to be helped out. There was a young lad, a boy from the Warwicks. He was about 19 and he helped me out. He was number 4 and I was number 5 when we took our places. And he said, I don't know who you are, sir, but I've got to say goodbye to somebody. We shook hands and the Germans made us turn around. We all got shot. Despite being shot through the chest and lung and receiving several other wounds, Gunner Fahey remained silent and would live to tell the tale. Following these first 2 groups of executions, perhaps unsurprisingly, when another 5 men were called for, no one came forward. All were determined to end, if they must, on their own terms. Frustrated, the remaining SS men now resorted to pouring automatic fire through the wooden walls of the shed until not a man stood. A silence descended on the scene of utter horror. The only sound to be heard was the footsteps of the perpetrators as they walked amongst the fallen, punctuated by the sudden report of a gunshot where a man was found to be still breathing. A few minutes later, with more than 80 men lying dead and the massacre complete, the SS simply walked away. Quite some time later, when it was clear that the perpetrators had gone, the survivors began to stir. All told, some 15 men were still living as night fell over Wormhoudt, with most so badly wounded they were unable to move. They passed that night and the next lying alongside their fallen friends. Tragically, thirst, blood loss and sheer desperation continued to take its toll, and by the time the survivors reached medical treatment, all but 6 had perished. Amongst those to survive was Brian Fahey, who recalled the discovery of the scene. On Friday morning we heard sounds and thought the Germans were coming there to finish us off. Instead they spoke to us, but we couldn't understand. One of them spoke in French, and summoning up memories from my school days, I was able to manage a conversation. He was dumbfounded. "Why are there no weapons or helmets or guns here?" he asked as he looked at the number of dead. Then he gave his own answer. "You were captured by the SS. They don't take prisoners." Amongst the other survivors who had somehow escaped the barn and found shelter nearby was Bert Evans. After playing dead in this pond for what seemed like eternity, and despite his shattered arm and neck wound, he dragged himself some 500 metres across these fields to finally find help from a local farmer and his family. Captured several days later, he would eventually be repatriated to Britain via Switzerland in 1943, when finally the authorities learned what came to pass here on that May Day in 1940. It was the testimony of Bert Evans, Brian Fahey and the other survivors who made sure that Wormhoudt was never forgotten. Tragically though, not one person was ever brought to justice for what happened here. Many of the perpetrators would not outlive the war, with most falling in the years to come on the Eastern Front, often having committed numerous similar crimes. One man that did survive was Wilhelm Mohnke, regarded by many as the man responsible for the massacre. Captured by the Red Army in Berlin at the end of the war, he spent 10 years in captivity, but when he finally returned to Germany, and despite a 30-year campaign for justice, it was not forthcoming. Mohnke himself would live a long life, dying in 2001, aged 90. Of the fallen, in the coming weeks and months, most were buried in mass graves nearby, eventually being transferred here to Eskelbeck Military Cemetery, where they remain to this day. Sadly, only 29 of the victims are buried beneath a known headstone. Amongst those to be remembered by name are Company Sergeant Major Augustus Jennings and Sergeant Stanley Moore. Most notably amongst the missing is Captain Lynn Allen, whose body was never recovered, and despite several searches in the post-war years, no trace has ever been found. He is though remembered by a headstone close to the pond where he lost his life, and remembered too by Bert Evans, who returned to this site every year in his later life to pay his respects to his friends and his captain, of whom he said, "That man saved my life. As we ran I collapsed and he could have got away but he didn't, and that's how he died. That's how my captain died, saving my life. He was a fine man and a fine soldier." Of the other survivors of the massacre, most would eventually return to civilian life. Men like Brian Fahey, who after returning home in 1945 would, despite the loss of a lung, embark on a successful career as a musical director and composer for the BBC. He died in April 2007, aged 87. But whatever their post-war achievements, the survivors of the Wormhoudt Massacre were forever bonded by those experiences, and most, if not all, would face further battles for decades to come. Today, for those who visit Wormhoudt, it's an incredibly powerful site, but much changed since the war. The original shed was knocked down in 1947 and a replacement erected on the same spot in 2001. But instead of bare walls and bullet holes, it now contains hundreds of wreaths and dedications in memory of those who gave their lives so that others at Dunkirk might live. Around the site are oak trees placed for each man who fell in the massacre, some of whom still lie buried within the site. They were joined by one more comrade in October 2013, Private Bert Evans, the last survivor of the Wormhoudt Massacre, who according to his wishes had his ashes scattered, by the pond that he remembered so well. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, then be sure to check out our companion video covering the nearby Captivity massacre right here on YouTube. And if you find the Second World War interesting, why not check out our brand new podcast, World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, where each week historians Jesse Alexander and Professor Matthias Strone explore some of the most famous topics of the Second World War from both the Allied and Axis perspectives. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.